The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada on Reality Radio 101. To get on board right now, send us an email. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you again today. I am so excited for today's show because we have Dr. Anna Lembke on with us today. And Dr. Lembke is a psychiatrist, professor, and author, and she is the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She's also the author of the bestseller, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, as well as Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. Dr. Lembke's books really focus on how we're going to make sense of the brain chemicals that are involved in our reward pathway, how those bumps of pleasure are absolutely everywhere, anytime, any place. And if we're constantly bombarding ourselves with pleasure, there is this danger of the opposite impact of pain coming on board. And she's going to help us understand how that pain pleasure mechanism works in our brains, and how, particularly right now, at this precise point in time, we are all more at risk of taking on too much dopamine, or, kind of activating our pleasure areas of the brain, and how that can get us into great trouble, increase our depression, our anxiety, leave us feeling that we have to use these things in order to get through our day. And I think probably everybody is struggling with this to some degree. I mean, I know that I do certain things that are probably not the best. I have some tendencies to doom scrolling, which I guess could be described as, what I do is I watch political YouTube videos because I'm very interested in what's happening politically. But I think then I get into this kind of spiral of looking for the next bit of information. And often it's the same as the last bit of information. But I think that fits into the whole issue of, that pleasure mechanism. So even though it might sound like pain, there's something about it that's rewarding. And when we keep kind of leaning into reward cycle, then it can do all sorts of things that take us out of a healthy, normal, balanced place. So Dr. Lembke is going to explain a lot of that, hopefully better than I just did. If you are interested in the conversation today, and you want to ask questions, and I hope you will, because we have, a world expert here today with Dr. Anna Lembke. You know how to get in touch with us, instudio101@gmail.com. And I hope you will join us in the conversation, bearing witness to evolving mind, mood, health. Dr. Anna Lembke, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I'm really kind of thrilled that you're here. Actually, I was just speaking with you a few minutes before, and I was saying that this book, Dopamine Nation, is the kind of book that can be life-changing for people, that it can help people understand what's really happening inside, and not only understand, because you're providing a lot of the science and research on this, but also really reflect on the areas where we may be addicted. And they may not be the kinds of consumptions that people have been kind of reflecting on from the past, chemical drugs or alcohol, cigarettes or marijuana or something like that. Those are things that people would have thought of before. But in fact, now we're thinking about food and gambling and shopping and gaming and texting and, what I was saying before, YouTubing and, finding our hits of pleasure in all sorts of areas. And you also talk a lot about the strategies that we can use to manage those things. And we'll get to that as well. So everybody, do bring your questions, your comments, your thoughts, or your life experiences. We would love to hear about them. And I want to start, Anna, with really the beginning. Why do we need to know about dopamine? What is this dopamine? What's this pain pleasure thing that you talk about so much, and the gremlins that go along with it?
So two of the most important findings in neuroscience in the past 50 to 100 years are, number one, the discovery of dopamine as a brain neurotransmitter in humans that is essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. And number two, the discovery that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain, meaning that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we experience pleasure, the balance tips one way, dopamine is released in our reward pathway, and when we experience pain, it tips in the other. But there are a couple fundamental rules governing this balance. And the first one is that the balance wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tilted very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance with any deviation from neutrality, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. So that drive for homeostasis is one of the overriding biological imperatives really in the universe, not just in human beings. So that means that when we do something pleasurable, our brain tips to the side of pleasure, we release dopamine. But no sooner has that happened than the way that our brain restores a neutral balance is first by tipping an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And of course, that's the come down or the after effect or the hangover. And then they jump off, and that urge to have another piece of chocolate or watch another video or, take another hit of a joint passes. And we're back to our baseline homeostasis. But if we do take another hit of the joint, or we do watch another YouTube video, or we do have another piece of chocolate, then what happens is that those gremlins start to multiply. And pretty soon we have enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And now we're entering addicted brain. And this is where we're in a chronic dopamine deficit state. And now we need more and more of our drug in more potent forms, not to feel good, but just to restore the balance and go back to the level position. And when we're not using, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving.
I think that is remarkable because, this whole idea that we could establish homeostasis, like we're back to the balanced place. But what you're saying is actually it's not about being back to the balanced place. If you're indulging in some kind of substance and the use has become more chronic over time, then in fact, the pain that you experience will be much more extreme in order to bring it back to that level place eventually. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's it, right? What happens is this pleasure pain balance, and of course, this is a simplified metaphor, but I think it works. It's meant to be a responsive to both pleasure and pain in the environment. That's how we navigate our ecosystem, but it's meant to go back to the level position in between hits of pleasure and hits of pain. And in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger where rewards are scarce, it does that, right? Because there aren't enough rewards around, and the ones that are there, we have to work really hard for. So most of the time, we're hanging out in that level position. But in the world we live in now, which is this world of overwhelming overabundance, where we have almost instantaneous access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors of all kinds, including drugs that didn't even exist 100 years ago, then what we have now is that we're constantly bombarding our reward pathway with dopamine. And to compensate, we've got more and more gremlins camped out on the pain side of the balance. And basically what's happened is we've changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we've got a pleasure pain balance that gets stuck, tilted to the side of pain. And once that happens, then we're kind of miserable. And we need so much pleasure to feel anything that resembles pleasure at all. And at the merest insult or discomfort or agita, we're in a lot of pain. So we've really, really recalibrated our brains. And this relentless pursuit of pleasure for its own sake has ultimately resulted in anhedonia, which is the inability to experience a joy and the kind of pervasive sense of misery.
Pain. When I think about pain, Anna, I think about not just physical pain, or my joints ache, or, I have stomach discomfort, and all that can be emotionally based as well. But I also think of pain as kind of anxiety, body felt emotional weight or discomfort. So when you think about pain in terms of the emotional elements of it, or how those emotional elements impact our body, can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts and feelings about that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because I think it is important for me to clarify that when I use pain, I'm really using in all its myriad forms. I'm talking about actual physical pain, but I'm also talking about all of these kind of less well-described types of physical discomfort, psychological discomfort, fear, anxiety, FOMO, fear of missing out, restlessness, all of it, kind of the sort of underlying discomfort that I think is, frankly, just part of being human, that we're all struggling with, in any given moment. And again, the great paradox here is that as we've created a world in which we're very good at insulating ourselves from not just physical pain, but really any kind of emotional suffering by distracting ourselves with some kind of pleasure. And as these pleasures have become more ubiquitous, more potent, and more bountiful, the great irony of this is that we're actually making ourselves more unhappy in the process because of the way that our reward system is wired.
There's something very interesting that you wrote very close to the end of the book about destructive shame cycle versus a pro-social shame cycle. And when I think about the pain of emotion, Lori, your client that you named Lori, disclosing to her church all of her, I guess, addictive behaviors and the things that she struggled with as a result of trying to self-soothe and using food and not feeling that she fit in. All that pain was emotional, and it was about not feeling like she belonged.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that destructive shame cycle versus the pro-social cycle?
Yes. So shame is a really important emotion when we think about the problem of addiction and compulsive overconsumption. Shame can be a driver that perpetuates these maladaptive behaviors, but it can also be something that wakes us up and motivates us to want to stop those behaviors. So it's a very interesting, powerful, and double-edged kind of emotion. And what I propose in the book is that the key factor here is not the distinction that's often made between guilt and shame, where shame is considered, where I feel bad about myself, and guilt is where I feel bad about what I've done, but basically feel okay about myself. What I'm trying to highlight here is that the real difference is how the people around us respond to our disclosure of transgression. And when people respond by further shaming us and or shunning us, or by basically telling us, what, you shouldn't share that. We don't want to know about that, which is what Lori's church did to her. Then you've got that spiral of destructive shame, where shame then contributes to the perpetuation of the addictive behavior as a way to escape that feeling. But there's an alternative to that, which I call pro-social shame, which is when the people around us, instead of rejecting us or shaming us further or telling us to not admit those uncomfortable untruths, they say, wow, you know what? Thank you for sharing. I really value your honesty. I can relate to that. I've got my own struggles. And here's a pathway which we can help you together to get out of this cycle of maladaptive, destructive, compulsive overconsumption. And the quintessential organization modeling this kind of pro-social shame is actually the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and other mutual help groups, where that person's transgression actually becomes a social good. It becomes something that the group values. It's part of the shared identity. And instead of saying, ew, gross, you're a yucky person, get out of here, which is unfortunately what a lot of religious organizations are doing. AA says, hey, wow, that's great. You're one of us. And we can really relate. And we have a method for helping you stop this behavior, which I think we can all agree is not good for you and not good for the people that you love. And here it is. It's the 12 steps. So I think that a lot of houses of worship, which are struggling to retain members, we're seeing a mass exodus of people out of organized religion. I think that they would do really well to take a look at what Alcoholics Anonymous is doing.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's quite unfortunate, but I think there's also something about, or maybe I'll run this by you. So I think there's something about thematic trauma that can drive some of these choice behaviors. So for example, in the case of Lori, I don't know, a lot about her other than what you wrote, but it seemed to me that she already had the disadvantage of a belief that on some level she wasn't acceptable, even from her family of origin. And then it was reinforced in the organizations that she would join, or the churches that she was a member of. I mean, I know for sure there are religious organizations that have a more kind of adaptive, embracing philosophy, not the ones that she was involved in, unfortunately. But I'm thinking about this idea of how we carry beliefs and themes, and that, we may use substances so that we have some relief from our own internalized belief about either being unacceptable or unlovable or something like that, based on life experiences, what it was like growing up, experiences in school, wherever we got that. Then we're looking for reinforcements of it, not on purpose, but because those are the beliefs that we have, and the theme becomes repetitive. The drugs are used to kind of help us relieve some of the pain of all of that. And when we stop using the drug, we are fully confronted with the theme. I'm unlovable. I'm unacceptable. I'm an idiot, whatever it is. What do you think about that?
First, let me say that I don't at all mean to imply that all religious organizations, shame people or shun people. There's a lot of data, and I've certainly seen the benefits of belonging to a religious organization. So thank you for highlighting that you're also aware of religious houses of worship that are conducive and supportive of positive mental health. But that particular case of Lori was an example where that wasn't true. There is loads of epidemiologic evidence showing that people who experience significant childhood trauma are at increased risk for developing addiction later in life. Fascinating animal experiments showing that if you get a rat addicted to cocaine by putting it in a cage with a lever that it can press to get cocaine, which rats typically will do until exhaustion or death. And then you take that cocaine away for a long period of time. If you then expose the rat to a painful foot shock, the first thing that it will do is run over to that lever and start pressing that lever to see if it can get cocaine, even after that behavior was extinguished by a long absence from cocaine. So that's just a way of illustrating that it's absolutely correct, as you described, that using substances can be a way to distract ourselves from all kinds of different pain. Because, if you slam down too hard on the pain side of the balance, either with physical or emotional pain, then the natural inclination is to want to reach for something that will bring it in balance again. And drugs do that. Even what seems to be irrational behavior associated with addiction has its rational underpinnings. And many of my patients will tell me, for a time, drugs worked for me. I could even argue that they saved my life, right? On some level, I'm not even sure I regret a certain period of drug use, which saved my life from the pain of the intolerable emotions or the intolerable situation that I found myself in. The problem is that drugs stop working after a while, and then they become a new problem because of the way that we're wired. The other thing that I muse about, and Dr. Anna, maybe you can reflect on this with me, is a couple things. How the addiction itself becomes a source of trauma, right? Because of our addiction, we get into a lot of problems in our lives, and our lives get very messy and chaotic. So now we've got trauma generated by the addiction itself, which is compounded on whatever kind of early trauma we might have had that drove us to substance use. But I also like to think about the ways in which our society kind of independently promotes self-loathing. So I don't think it's necessarily true that we have to have grown up in a situation where we were made to feel bad about ourselves in order to feel really bad about ourselves. So kind of self-hatred and self-loathing seems to be in and of itself endemic on some level in society, which I think is really cause for reflection around, like, what are we doing as a society that leads to that? And I do think it's the kind of a narcissistic preoccupation with individual achievement that in and of itself can drive self-loathing in a cohort of human organisms, even if raised in a perfectly loving family.
Oh, well, that is just tragic and unfortunately true, particularly in the age where social comparison is so easy to make, and one person's life can look so lovely when maybe they're actually suffering themselves, and we're busy comparing ourselves to them. I was just going to make one comment. You had been describing what might happen with addicted rodents who will go back to the substance use. Interestingly, and I'm sure that you're aware of this work, but during World War I, veterans who were, well, at the time while they were deployed, if they were injured and they were given some kind of opioid substance to manage pain or deal with injury, many of them who might have been considered addicted while they were overseas, when they came back, they actually stopped their use. Not all of them, But many of them did stop when they returned to their countries of origin and when they were able to be with loving family and friends. So that was, interesting to read about as well.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with similar studies of Vietnam War veterans. So I'm not familiar with World War II veterans, but there's a very famous study of Vietnam War veterans, most of whom were stationed somewhere in Asia, somewhere near what's called the Golden Triangle, where there's the cultivation and exportation of massive amounts of opioids in the form of opium and heroin. And many of those soldiers, when they were in a place of easy access, plus the stress and frankly things like the boredom of war, got used opioids and yes, got addicted to opioids. And about 2/3 of those individuals or more, it may even been more like closer to 80 or 90% of those individuals, upon return to the United States, where access to opioids in the 1970s was much less, most of those individuals just stopped using without any treatment or any other intervention, which is a really important data point because it speaks to the enormous influence of access to our drug as a major risk factor for developing addiction. There are many risk factors. There's inherited or inborn risk. There's the environment that we were raised in, as we were talking about. But there's also simple access. If you live in a place where drugs are sold on the street corner, you're more likely to try them, more likely to get addicted to them. And what's so tragic and fascinating about the United States is that in the 70s, these soldiers came back, couldn't get opioids, just stopped, and that was it. Their addiction was over. Contrast that with the early 2000s up into the present day, where all of a sudden doctors started prescribing opioids like candy to anybody who had any kind of pain condition. And that is essentially what caused the current US opioid epidemic. So access is really, really an important risk factor that people often forget about.
And the other piece of it, of course, and thank you, by the way, for correcting me. Yes, you have reminded me it is this research on Vietnam vets. So I'm so glad that you're up to date on the research. It's not my main area of work. One of the things that concerns me so much is, drugs like OxyContin that were, so addictive that people who were legitimately taking, medicine for a period of time, which should have only been a short period of time, ended up being absolutely without capacity to stop, without aid from another drug to get off of the first drug.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, the thing to realize about OxyContin, which by the way is still prescribed for pain, even though Purdue has declared bankruptcy, there are many generic forms of OxyContin. It's still very widely prescribed for pain. And again, this is not to say that opioids should never be used. They're a very important and valuable tool, especially when used judiciously, short term, for very severe pain, perioperatively, or at the end of life. But what was happening in this country, and to some extent is still happening, is that they were being prescribed for minor and chronic pain conditions at higher and higher doses for longer and longer periods of time, so that we were seeing and still sometimes see people on 1,000 morphine milligram equivalents of opioid medication per day, which, honestly would kill a baby elephant. So, that's the crazy part, where this tool that was useful started to be used at such high doses and for such long periods. And we know that the risk of addiction to opioids is dose and duration dependent. So the longer you're on it and the higher the dose, the more likely you are to get addicted to the opioid and the more likely you are to die from it. And this can happen to people who have never struggled with addiction. So, it's easy to say like, oh, that'll never happen to me, or I couldn't never be in that situation. And yet you would be amazed at how easy it is once we find our particular drug of choice to slip into that addicted vortex.
Yeah, I can imagine it. Absolutely. And I recently found myself in hospital late February with acute appendicitis. And when the ambulance attendant said, "Oh, I think you're having an appendicitis attack," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, right, okay." and he's wanting to give me intravenous hydromorphone. And I'm like, really? Do I need that? I have a very high pain threshold. So when he gave me the intravenous hydromorphone, because I guess he had a better idea of how much pain I was actually in, I had an epiphany that I never really understood fully how easy it is to get addicted. Because in that moment when he put this in intravenously, I became aware of a relief that I didn't even realize how much pain and discomfort I was in and how much this was impairing me. But as soon as I got the hydromorphone, it was like, oh my God, I get it now. This would be so easy to get addicted to. You know, it's not hard to picture it.
Yeah. And that's exactly how it happens, right? You get exposed through a medical procedure and you have this very strong positive psychological and physiological reaction. Sometimes people describe it as a warm blanket, a sense of peace and calmness that they've always been striving for and never felt, actually feeling like a quote unquote normal person. All of these kinds of very core feelings that somehow, get answered by this drug. I mean, why? Of course, you're going to go back to that unless you have a lot of advance warning about the inherent risks associated with that. And that's what patients didn't have because doctors didn't have the information. They hadn't been properly trained about the addictive potential of these drugs. In fact, they'd been trained in the opposite direction. They were told that as long as they were prescribing it for pain, that there was a physiologic barrier to that individual getting addicted to the opioid. And it turns out that's totally untrue. It doesn't matter why you're taking the opioid, whether you're taking it for fun or taking it for pain. The risks of addiction are real and true and can happen to anybody.
Exactly. So I want to read a few of our emails that are coming in because there's a whole bunch of them and they're coming in fast and furious, Anna. But I just want to mention if people are interested in learning a little bit more about what happened with OxyContin in the US, there's a great series called Dope Sick, the shocking true story of America's opioid epidemic. And it is really, really worth watching. It's very informative. I don't know if you've seen it, Anna, but it's very well done.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. So, we actually have people from all over the world who listen to this radio show. And I'm going to read this one. This is from Marangu, who says, "Dear doctor, it is always a pleasure to listen to your radio conversations. I've been educated and informed as I listen from Africa, specifically Kenya. I keep looking forward to the next session. Thank you again. Kindest regards." And I hope that you're finding this interesting today, as I certainly am. And let's go through some of the questions that are coming in right now. This is from Sadie, and she asks, doctors, is Dr. Lembke's book more for medical professionals or for the layman? What are your thoughts, Anna?
Very much written for a general audience. The metaphor that I talked about with the pleasure-pain balance is described with pictures in the book. I use a lot of patient stories. These are real-life patients who are generous enough to allow me to share their stories with a pseudonym. So, but the stories are as written, totally true. So, Sadie, you can reach for the book. Rest assured that you will easily understand the concepts and that they're presented in a way that's very accessible.
And the stories are really compelling. It kind of really does a good job of presenting the issues in a way that feels very human. There's nothing preachy in that book. It feels like you're learning what you need to learn to prepare yourself and to understand what's really happening in your brain, so that, maybe if you have an addiction, and then all of a sudden you're engaging in that thing, then when you have that pain stomping on you, or the increased anxiety or depression or bodily sensations that are acute, you will understand that you're now in that cycle where you've had so much dopamine from that pleasure impulse, that overconsumption, the stimulus, that you're now having an overweighting on the pain area. It's just remarkable. You do a great job of explaining it, Anna. And I had said before, that this book, I think, has the potential to save lives, honestly.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's worth reading. Here's another one. This is from Tommy. Hi, Dr. Baranowski. Are there ways to increase and potentially decrease dopamine?
Yeah, so this gets to the prescriptive part of the book where, after we understand the problem and the pleasure-pain balance and about how that dopamine deficit state is the brain trying to accommodate too much dopamine, what can we do about it? And the first thing that we can do about it is we can abstain from our drug of choice for long enough for those gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis or neutrality to be restored. So this is where I recommend that we sort of think about what is that drug or that behavior that I have a conflicted relationship that I use too much of, that once I start, I have difficulty stopping, that feels good in the moment, but makes me feel worse afterward, and really make a very serious commitment to stop using that drug for 30 days, knowing that initially we will feel worse before we'll feel better, because initially, without anything on the pleasure side, those gremlins who take a while to dismount are going to push us down to the pain side, and we're going to go into withdrawal. And this is even putting our phone away for a period of time can lead to this phenomenon. The other big part of the prescription for resetting our dopamine reward pathways is to actually invite pain into our lives. So it turns out that if we press intentionally on the pain side of the balance with mild to moderate painful or noxious stimuli, what we do is trigger the body's own natural healing mechanisms. We trigger the body to start to make more dopamine, to upregulate serotonin and norepinephrine and our endogenous opioids and endogenous cannabinoids. And that way, we actually get the gremlins to then hop on the pleasure side of the balance in order to shift our overall hedonic set point to the side of pleasure. And this is essentially the science of hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And what we're setting in motion is our own innate healing mechanisms. So I prescribe things like exercise, ice cold water therapy, intermittent fasting. The key is to do these things in moderation, not to do them in some kind of extreme sense, but by engaging in and inviting ascetic practices into our lives, physical and mental. What we end up doing is generating more natural dopamine, which then allows us to experience more natural joy in our lives.
When I was reading your book, I was thinking about the use of psychotherapy, psychological treatment, as a way of engaging this hormesis, because I think for a lot of people, it can feel painful to lean towards and allow yourself to fully be in, without resistance, be in that place of your own lived experience, anxiety, frustration, irritation, emotional despair, whatever that might be. And yet there seems to be culturally a lot of resistance to that, as if it's unacceptable to be anything but happy. I have real qualms about the happiness research and how there seems to be this over promotion of happiness within our culture, as opposed to a more balanced understanding that life has all the flavors.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I love your idea of psychotherapy, good psychotherapy, as really an opportunity to just sit with our pain. And something very fascinating happens when we stop trying to run away from our pain and instead just sort of turn and face it and embrace it, radically accept it, say, okay, this is my life. This is who I am. This is what I am going to have to experience. And sort of like a Gordian knot, when we really do that, something miraculous happens and the knot begins to loosen itself. And we can carry that pain more easily when we stop trying to run from it. So it's very fascinating to me.
I also find something interesting about emotional pain that in its essence, when we're not battling it in any way, but really leaning towards it, it can be actually quite lovely. There's something very sweet about coming into contact with our real truth, with whatever lives within, without that battle, without that tendency to give ourselves the stories, oh, this is unacceptable, you should never feel that way, you should not think that way, you have no right to those feelings, you should always be happy. I had a dinner with some very good friends. We sat around an outdoor fire, we were eating dinner, and one of my friends leaned towards me and she said, I just heard some very bad news only a couple of days ago, and I noticed I'm very, very sad about it. And I thought, well, you're a lovely, sensitive person with beautiful qualities, and it's normal and natural to be with that sadness and to not push it away for a little while. It's one thing if it becomes clinical, but here we're talking about a person who has really a lovely, sweet, empathic, generous nature. She cares about people. And she was feeling bad because she was, feeling like she didn't have a right to her sadness over what she had just learned. We have this tendency to want to just push it away and move into happiness. And, I guess it causes a lot of destruction in people's lives.
Yeah, yes, exactly. We've sort of lost our right to be unhappy. And in that way, we're sort of dominated by this culture of, if you're not ecstatic all the time, something's wrong with you or wrong with your life. And that's really unfortunate because, first of all, being happy all the time is just simply not consistent with human experience. Getting in touch with our pain is a way to create meaning and purpose, to motivate us. And also just the constant running, because it's futile, it's exhausting. So to just stop for a while and say, okay, I'm just going to rest in this pain, and to know you're not alone, that we all suffer, we all struggle. This is the human condition. There's not something wrong with you. I have many patients who come in wanting help for depression. And on top of feeling depressed, they also feel guilty because they feel like they shouldn't be depressed. These are people who, objectively speaking, have material wealth and plenty of friends and good family and good jobs. But I always normalize it. I always say, life is hard. And there is a lot of suffering in life, and it doesn't have to be for a reason. Just being alive is uncomfortable at times. And there are these natural biorhythms of ups and downs. Without one, we wouldn't know the other. But just to, sort of normalize and accept kind of the pain of life. And also if we're just sort of dysphoric types, which as I talk about in the book, I kind of came to embrace ultimately that I'm just at baseline kind of cranky and depressed. And that's okay. That's okay. Like, because of that, I may not, have as much sort of at ease settledness as other people I know. But on the other hand, that gives me a kind of creativity and energy that I hope can contribute something positive to the world out of my pain.
Well, whatever you're doing with your crankiness, it seems to be working. And clearly, you're doing very meaningful things in the world. And maybe that's the point, that, we're really not meant to be in this super happy place all the time. Sometimes we have to use that full range and, figure out, what is our superpower.
Right.
And I think we don't find our superpower if we're following some kind of prescription for one flat tone way of being in the world being the only acceptable way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
I want to go over what you had said, abstinence, 30 days. Now, people are going to have a hard time with that, as you very well understand. And you've written about that in the book, how sometimes you can work with somebody and it's just not going to be that easy initially. You've got to get that buy-in, and that person has to really lean into this idea of, I'm ready to take this on and give it up, because there's a lot of resistance to that. Oh my goodness. But you've come up with some really interesting ideas around binding. And the other piece of it was things that people do that you've learned from the people that you work with, like the ice therapy, where you can really give yourself a way of pressing on the pain so that you can get yourself out of the cycle of simply using this dopamine hit, another dopamine hit. So can you talk about binding and talk a little bit more about kind of engaging the buy-in to do the 30 days of abstinence?
Sure. So one of the things that I do with my patients when I'm talking about this dopamine detox or dopamine fast or this abstinence trial is I talk about it as an experiment. And I suggest that we're all scientists hypothesizing continually and experimenting on our lives in order to improve them. And that the neuroscience suggests that the abstinence or dopamine fast will reset reward pathways. But the only way to really know is to give it a try. So I like that language because I think people embrace neuroscience and they like this idea of kind of doing an experiment. 30 days is typically an amount of time people can wrap their head around. If I say you can never drink again, that's not really going to motivate people. And then I'm very honest with folks about that it's going to be hard. So this is something that I've learned over the years. If we try to minimize how hard it's going to be, and then folks go out and find it extremely hard, not only are they like hurt and surprised, but then they lose trust in us. So instead, I really kind of paradox them and I emphasize like this is going to be really, really hard. Then sometimes if it's a little easier than that, then they're pleasantly surprised. And then how to prepare for it. I talk about self-binding. So self-binding is this idea that we have to create literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice in order to be successful. If we rely on willpower alone, we will not be successful, because once we have the desire to consume and our drug is readily available, it's almost impossible to stop ourselves, especially if it's part of our daily routine or habit. So what we have to do is put barriers between ourselves and the drug so that we have just an extra moment to remind ourselves, oh, wait, I wasn't going to use that drug this month. That's things like deleting the app from the phone, getting the alcohol out of the house. Or when we're traveling, calling ahead and saying, remove the minibar, remove the television or the remote control from the room. It can even be things like taking certain medications like opioid receptor blockers, which is self-binding on a chemical level, which can help people not drink alcohol, because alcohol is largely mediated through not just dopamine, but our endogenous opioid system. So by blocking the opioid receptor with the medication, what happens is not only do we get less reinforcement if we were to drink, but even the craving to drink is less, because typically when we think of our drug or have a euphoric recall, we get a little hit of dopamine. And that then creates the craving to want to go get the drug. But if, a drug is on board that actually stops the release of dopamine with the recall, then we don't have as much craving. So a lot of different things like that. The 30 days is in itself a way to use chronology as self-binding, right? To tell ourselves, okay, I can't have a drink for 30 days, but when that 30 days is over, I will be able to have a drink. And that's something that helps people. And then when they say, well, what if I do it? I have self-binding, I've gotten the drug out of the house, I'm not hanging out with folks who use, I've removed the apps, but I still in that moment, I'm overwhelmed with craving. Then I do something that's really counterintuitive. And I say in that moment, instead of reaching for a different drug to soothe yourself, which is sort of common wisdom or advice, I say do something that's actually harder than the pain of withdrawal. So go for a run, immerse yourself in ice cold water, do 50 sit-ups, reach out to a friend, even if you're feeling vulnerable and not like you want to talk. Reach out to a sponsor if you're in AA, because by pressing harder on the pain side of the balance than the gremlins are pressing, what we actually do is get those gremlins to switch sides and go beyond the pleasure side. So, there is all kinds of evidence for this. Like, for example, just actually a interesting new article came out about a chemical that's created with intense exercise that is an appetite suppressant. So how doing these things that are, really strenuous, either physically or mentally, actually do have an impact on our appetitive control. So those are the types of things that I recommend, as well as, encouraging people to want to live consistent with their goals and values, and fleshing out what those are and how the use of their drug, interferes with that. One of the things I'll do that's a way of pressing on the pain side of the balance is I'll ask people to not tell a single lie over the next 30 days. And that's really hard to do because we're all natural liars. But I've learned from my patients that kind of radical honesty is really important if we're wanting to manage compulsive overconsumption, especially the kind that occurs outside our conscious awareness.
Mm-hmm. And certainly with that more honesty telling, disclosure, you tend to feel more connected with people as well. And that would help to nourish us as well. I just want to comment that if people want a really interesting example of what Dr. Lembke is saying, there's a YouTube video that looks at a 7-day detox by this fellow, Leon Hendricks. He did the YouTube video is called How Dopamine Detoxing Changed My Brain. And it really is based on the work that you're doing, but he only did it for 7 days. But what he did for 7 days was he cut out all the pleasurable stuff. No sugar, no junk food, no video games, no podcasts, no gaming. And instead he was just really focused on non-stimulating content, meditation, reading, going for a walk, like things that were nourishing, but not in a highly stimulating way. So I think it's an interesting and helpful thing to do if you're considering going on a dopamine detox, to consider watching this video just so that you get a little perspective. It was very interesting, Leon's comments about removing all the temptations and defining rules and kind of looking at the, inner triggers, and then also what his self-awareness increased and his sense of focus and concentration increased as he limited his exposures to these stimuli. And just what can happen. I mean, I understand that in your research, and research supports this, that it's really 30 days. You need the 30 days, but 7 days seems so much easier to contemplate when you're thinking about giving up a whole lot of stuff. So I would just say, watch the 7-day one with the idea that it's probably best to just follow the full 30 days, but it can certainly be life-changing in terms of your inner experience once you've crossed the threshold. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. In fact, at this point, I'm even encouraging people to do like a 24-hour digital detox, because people, feel a real sense of overwhelming panic when they think about giving up their smartphones. But to do it for 24 hours, most people could contemplate that. And I think that even that is a very good exercise. And what I ask people to do is to be aware in the first sort of half of that day how much they're craving and how many intrusive thoughts they have about why they should check their phone, which is really the mastermind of the brain trying to get them, back engaged with the drug. We'll come up with all kinds of reasons why we must use, even though we a pledge not to, and just observe those. So this is a great opportunity to become more aware of ourselves, to practice what we call mindfulness, which is a ability to be detached and observe our feelings and thoughts without judgment, and also without trying to get rid of those feelings and thoughts, but watching them pass over us in a time-limited fashion. So I think, any degree of this kind of experiment, super potentially useful opportunity to learn about ourselves and our relationship with these drugs that are so ubiquitous in our environment.
Mm-hmm. Everywhere. Absolutely. Anytime. I'm going to read one last email. We had so many emails. There's no possible way I can get through them all today, Anna. But I will just say this has been an exceptionally interesting show today. And I would invite you back anytime you have a free hour that you want to visit with us, because people are so interested in what you have to say. This one is from Sherry, who says, can your guests tell us how the experience of being on Netflix was, the social dilemma, Netflix?
Yeah, so that was an interesting experience. First of all, I was interviewed about 2 years before it came out, and then my kids were interviewed about a year. They came back and interviewed our 2 older children, which was, that was interesting to have them involved. If I'm being totally honest, I thought that I didn't think that the movie would have as big an impact as it did, because I assumed that people already knew these things, or were more aware than they really were. And the fact that so many people watched the Social Dilemma, and that it was such news to them, was news to me, because it made me realize, wow, I've been thinking about these problems and the dark side of technology for 20 years. And probably part of that is that I'm a psychiatrist, and I see people coming in with pornography and social media and gaming and gambling addiction, all really exacerbated greatly by these digital devices and the smartphone in particular. And also, I live in Silicon Valley, where I think, because we're sort of at the heart of this tech revolution, we're also at the heart, perhaps, of thinking about the problems associated with it. I was surprised at how widely viewed it was.
Right, and I think people really don't know how problematic social media actually is. But probably most of us have had an experience where we're sitting down to dinner with friends or something, and we have people around the table, or maybe ourselves, and we just can't stop touching our phones. Yeah. Like, we can't. And it's like every time we have a beep on our phone, it's like we get all excited and we feel better about ourselves. People are reaching out to us, like, right. There's something about it.
Yeah. And this is where I really want people to do the experiment, where they literally put the phone in a lockbox where they don't have access to it for 24 hours. And what's fascinating about it is how, in a way, it is easier to literally be physically removed from the device, where you don't have the choice. It's the burden of choice, which combined with the dopamine hit, combined with the constant sort of distraction of anticipation of interacting with the phone, that really occupies a lot of mental real estate. And people don't realize how much it's contributing to stress and exhaustion and other negative emotions.
Yeah, if all of our energy is going into maintaining all of that real estate, like
right.
All of these social media platforms and devices and ways of communicating, and only feeling good when we get the next hit. And, it's quite consuming. It can definitely take up a lot of our focus and attention and make us inefficient in the work that we are trying to do.
Yes.
I would say that if people are finding this conversation interesting, there's a lot available on the work of Dr. Anna Lembke. I would really strongly encourage you to either listen to or read the book. I personally like having my hands on a physical book, which I have in front of me, the physical book, which I'm going to hand over to my husband because he was fascinated about it. And I'm going to end with one more question. This came from my breakfast table, which was, do you think that frustration, anger, outbursts of frustration, anger, and irritation in normal social conversation, like if you're irritable, is that also potentially going to give you a dopamine hit?
Interesting. So the question of rageaholism. Yeah. So it really depends on the person, but there's no doubt that for some people, there's a dopamine kick with adrenaline, and that adrenaline junkies can get adrenaline by fighting with other humans. And for some people, that absolutely is their drug of choice.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Anna Lembke, sharing your thoughts about Dopamine Nation, your very popular book. And do you have any last words for us?
Really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much to you and also your listeners.
Thank you so very much. Have a great afternoon. It was a delight, and I hope we'll have you back again sometime. It was so great, Anna. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. It was really my pleasure. Kind of a kindred spirit conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Be well. We'll talk again.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.